A few years back, I rented a cabin with my friend Jennifer out in the forest. We were in the mood to spend some time out in nature, but we weren't willing to go all the way and spend time in tents. Because of this, she rented the cabin, and we were set to spend 2 weeks there. The cabin itself was set pretty far out into the woods. There were no other cabins that were really close by to it. We wanted the full experience and felt that being isolated was the best way to get this. There wasn't electricity, so there wasn't a TV or anything like that. There was a propane tank that gave us hot water and allowed us to use the stove. Other than that, it was pretty rustic. For the first week, we had the sort of experience we had been looking to get. We did some hiking, some fishing, saw all sorts of birds and other animals. We actually began to feel really relaxed being far away from any people. At the beginning of the second week, though, we were inside preparing lunch when all of a sudden we heard a knock at the door. Needless to say, we were very surprised. It was the first contact we'd had with a single person since we'd gone. I went to check the door, only to see there was a man standing there, possibly in his mid-30s or so, waiting outside. I asked the man what he needed, and he told me he was the landlord for the cabin. He was there to collect the rent for the week. This was puzzling, because not only had we never seen this guy before, we'd also paid for the cabin in full before we moved in. I told him this, of course, and he said he didn't know what we were talking about. He then told us that if we did not pay him for the week, he would have to call the police and remove us from the cabin forcibly. I got extremely angry at this point and told him to go right ahead. We had the receipts showing we had paid for this cabin in full. The man began to get irate again, starting to yell at me, so I slammed the door right in his face. We watched from the window as the man went out to his Jeep and drove away. I figured he must be some sort of con artist and tried to put it out of my mind. It seemed like a really stupid con, though. That had been around noontime or so, and we hadn't seen or heard from that person again. We figured he'd realized we'd seen through his con, and thusly was not going to try again. Jennifer went to her room and went to bed early. I, though, decided to stay up and do some reading before bed. It was pretty late now. I heard Jennifer scream in the other room. Immediately, I dropped my book, shot up, and ran over to her door. I didn't even have to knock on it, as she threw the door open and grabbed me. A noise woke me up, and that guy from earlier was looking in through my window, Jennifer told me frantically. I rushed into the bedroom and looked out, but the guy was not there any longer. Well, at first I thought so, but then I began to hear a pounding on the front door, a loud, frantic pounding. I ran into the living room and saw the man looking in through the window. He looked extremely pissed. "Give me my damn money!" he began shouting over and over again. I was happy that the door was locked. The man moved away, but just when I thought he had gone, I heard a crashing noise and a rock came flying through one of the living room windows. Glass shattered all over the place. The man then tried to come into the house through the window. He had gotten partway in and was trying to pull the curtains to the side. I was at a complete loss as to what to do. I didn't have a gun or anything like that, which at this point in time made me feel real bad about it. Jennifer, however, had her wits about her. She ran into the kitchen and grabbed a heavy skillet. By the time the intruder got the curtain out of his face, Jennifer slammed him right in the face with the pan. When he fell back, she smacked him again. The second hit knocked him over, and the third hit knocked him out cold. Jennifer panicked again, and for a moment I thought the man hadn't been knocked out yet. She reached down and picked something up off the ground. The man had broken in through our window, holding a meat cleaver in his hand. Who knows what would have happened if Jennifer hadn't acted so swiftly. Have you ever driven through one of those really rural areas and seen those old gray, abandoned, and weather-torn buildings just sitting off the road? Some of them are set in the strangest places, and you wonder why anyone would ever have built a building there. I enjoy exploring those sorts of places due to the way it allows my imagination to think about what the building's history was. You sometimes find these sorts of places out in the middle of forests or fields. In those cases, I tend to assume that they were there first, and the forest eventually grew up around the buildings once they'd been abandoned. A few years back, I was exploring out in the woods, trying to find some new cool places. I was going pretty deep now, possibly trespassing on someone else's property, but I didn't really care much about that. Late in the afternoon, around the time when I should have begun to head back, I came across a particularly dilapidated 2-story building. The building itself was heavily rotting, and it was covered with moss. It even had a tree growing right through the center. I had no idea how long this building could have possibly been here. I had to be extremely careful entering. As far as I knew, anything that looked worn down might have weak floors and might collapse at any moment. Walking up the steps, I definitely heard some loud creaks, but despite my initial worries, the steps held up rather well. It was when I entered through the door that I finally realized what this building must have been. There was a very small foyer that led into the main room, which took up the majority of the bottom floor. I was surprised to discover that this appeared to be a one-room schoolhouse. There were old desks lined up in straight rows, and even a chalkboard on the wall farthest from me. I had never seen a one-room school in person before, so I was very intrigued. I walked through and past the desks to where I saw another door. It must lead to a back room, I assumed, since it wasn't set far enough back to be a back door to the building itself. I opened the door and noticed it seemed to be some sort of office or something. That wasn't what caught my attention, though. The floor was absolutely covered in animal bones, and I don't mean just a little bit. There were piles of bones up to my ankles all over the floor. The bones were strung together with string, and some hung from the walls and ceiling. I was freaked out and decided to head back to the main room. As I started to move, though, something else caught my attention urgently. The floor had been creaking as I was walking along, but when I stopped, I realized I could hear something else creaking above my head. It was a 2-story building, and it was apparent that something was on the top floor. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but still I felt rather uncomfortable. I thought it might be a good idea to just get the hell out of there. I took my camera out to snap a few pictures before leaving. When I decided to try and get a shot of the lighting fixtures on the ceiling, I turned the camera up, and that's when I saw it. Half of a human face, looking down through a little hole in the ceiling. The eyes watching me blinked. I nearly pissed myself and dropped my camera. The face disappeared back into the darkness upstairs. I began to hear rapid creaking sounds as the person upstairs began to randomly walk around. Then I heard them start sprinting toward the staircase. I'd had enough. I found my camera and grabbed it. I decided to get the hell out of there. I ran out, and I didn't look back at all. I ran out of the building and kept going until I was sure that person was not following me. It's weird in a way because I had no way of knowing what the person in that building was or if they were dangerous in any way. But for some reason, hearing them come down the stairs like that was the most frightening experience of my entire life. I didn't even want to see the person themselves. I mean, sure, I was out in the middle of nowhere, searching through an abandoned building. That person was there before me on the exact same day. So I decided it best to just leave them to whatever they were doing. When my dad passed away, one of the many things he left me was his cabin. I hadn't been to it since I was a little kid. Being out in the wilderness was never really my thing. Although it had electricity and even one of those big old satellite dishes, I still always felt it was too far away from civilization to truly enjoy it. It meant a whole lot to my father, though, so when I inherited it, I decided not to sell it. I went up to it occasionally, just to maintain it and make sure it was safe and secure still. I never had any intentions of spending significant time there myself, though about 5 years after I took possession of the cabin, I had a really unpleasant experience when I went to do a routine check of the place. When I would do this, I generally drove up for the weekend. It was a very long drive from where I lived, so I would spend the entire weekend there, then head home. This particular time, the weather report proved to be extremely wrong on the way to the cabin. Dark green and black clouds began to overtake the entire sky while I was driving out into the hills. I had a front row seat to an amazing lightning show, though. This was going to be one of those really nasty storms. I could tell the minute I arrived at the cabin. I couldn't figure out why, but I immediately had a feeling of nervousness wash over me. I was hoping this was just because of the storm, and not that I was getting a sixth sense about something. The rain began to fall about 5 minutes prior to my arrival. It was pouring down extremely hard by the time I left my car. I hadn't brought an umbrella with me and had to run to the door. I was distressed to realize the door was unlocked. I began to worry right away because of this. It had been about 6 months since the last time I had been there, so I had no way of remembering if I had locked it or not. I was concerned someone may have robbed me in the meantime. I went inside and for the most part, everything looked pretty normal. That was until I went into the kitchen, and I got really concerned. The window on the kitchen door was broken and had a garbage bag taped up over it. I certainly hadn't done that. Someone had broken in. I immediately went to the front door and locked it shut. If the person had been staying there, though, they didn't seem to be here now. I checked throughout the cabin and made sure all the windows were locked. I would have gone back out to my car and went to the police if the rain weren't coming down as hard as it was. I went throughout the house and checked to see if anything was missing. The bedroom was a bit of a mess. I checked the closet though, and thankfully my dad's shotgun was still right where I'd left it. I really had no experience with guns, but I did know how to load it. I did so and laid it down on the bed. If someone had been living there and was going to be coming back, I needed to be prepared for if they were dangerous. I had been in the cabin for a few hours before nightfall fell. I made sure the lights in the front room were on, so if whoever had been there came back, they would see that somebody was there now. It was really late at night when I saw a pair of headlights shine through the front window and onto the cabin wall. Peeking outside, I saw what I assumed to be a large truck with its high beams on. 2 people got out of the cab, but didn't turn the lights off. I was already worried, but I was even more so when I noticed both of them looked to be carrying rifles with them. They stood in front of the truck for a moment before I saw them begin to walk forward. They stopped at my car and stood on either side. I watched as both of them raised the butt of their rifles and heard the sound of both of my car windows shattering. After that, they shattered the back windows as well, then began moving back toward the house. Of course, I panicked. I had 2 people who were obviously the ones who had broken into my father's cabin, approaching it after breaking the windows out of my car. I ran over and grabbed the shotgun. I wasn't sure what I could do, because I wasn't going to open the door for them. That would expose myself right proper, but these guys were going to get up to the cabin door, and who knew what they would do if they got a hold of me. I went and broke the window of the front door. I stuck the barrel of the shotgun out and pulled the trigger. In addition to the loud explosion, I heard one of the guys scream out and fall over. I was concerned I'd blasted him directly. I'd simply wanted to fire a warning shot. The other took his rifle and shot at the house a couple of times. I watched from a vantage point from which neither man could see me. I saw him help the other man to his feet and pull him back to the truck. He tossed the hurt guy into the cab and they drove off. I spent the rest of the night completely on edge, expecting them to return. The interior of my car was completely ruined. I had to clean it out to at least drive into town. I brought the sheriff out and let him look around. I ended up spending a few more days up there, restoring the damage done to my cabin. There wasn't a whole lot more I could do, other than install a security system. I try to go up to it every couple of months now instead of every 6, and each time I do, it's scary as hell. Every time I open that door, I expect one of those guys to be back there. When I was little, I lived in a very safe neighborhood. All the neighbors were either friends or relatives of friends. And this being the late 80s, we were allowed to roam and play however much we wanted, as long as we'd be back home before dinner. The earliest encounter I can remember with this creep was when I was around 6 years old or so. I was with a group of other kids, riding our bikes down the steep hill that led down into our neighborhood. One of the other kids suddenly noticed a man standing against a fence at the top of the hill, not very far away from this parked blue van. I didn't recognize the man, and neither did anyone else around me, but that didn't really mean anything at the time. I had only just been allowed to leave the yard, and assumed I didn't know everyone in the area yet. I don't know why, but we all decided to go over to him. My parents had told me to stay with the group, so I just followed along behind. I don't really remember much about the man, only that he seemed to pay an extraordinary amount of attention to me. Even after the other kids had wandered off to continue riding on their bikes, the man kept me staying and talking. I remember very clearly how when he asked my age and I told him, he smiled this big creepy smile and said I looked much older, at least 12 or 13. I guess this was supposed to be a compliment, but I was aware of how much younger I looked and was compared to everyone else. I mean, I didn't even have a bike because I was too small to reach the pedals on my own. I even had pigtails with ribbons in them. I don't know if he creeped me out exactly, but I quickly excused myself and rejoined the group. Honestly, I think I felt more insulted than anything, like he was making fun of me by pointing out I didn't really belong with this group of teenagers. Eventually, I went home though, and I didn't tell my parents about the man. In my mind, he was an adult and I wasn't allowed to question adults at that age. Stranger danger had never really been much of a thing in my family. Skip ahead 3 years now. It was Christmas and I was 9 years old. I'd finally been given my very own bike. And this one was not a little kid's bike either. I was so proud I just had to go out to try it, despite the cold weather. Of course, my parents allowed it right away. I headed out to that hill all alone. It was Christmas, and no one was going to come play on Christmas morning. I had spent about 20 minutes rocketing down the hill on my cherry red bicycle. I even wiped out once, skinning my palms, when I started to notice a blue van driving by slowly and repeatedly as well. I didn't remember that previous encounter at this point. I suppose, like for any 6-year-old, something that happened 3 years ago was completely inconsequential at the time, and I'd quickly forgotten about it. This van drove down the road, past the drive into the neighborhood, at least 3 times. I got this very strange feeling, a tingling down my spine, like someone was watching me. I'd never had that feeling before in my life. The only way I can describe it is a visceral, primitive warning that you're now the prey to someone very dangerous. Luckily, I was able to keep my cool though. I kept on riding my bike and watched that same van drive slowly by back and forth at least a dozen times. Finally, when it passed me by for the last time and disappeared behind some trees, I took the opportunity to book it down the hill, using gravity and every bit of strength in my legs to build up enough speed to get me all the way to the end of the drive. I did it so fast I didn't even have to stop. Quite a feat since my house was the very last one. I ditched my brand new bike in the grass and ran inside to safety. Again, I didn't tell my parents though, half because I felt like I was just being silly, and half because my mom was cooking and my dad was watching TV. 2 activities to never be interrupted in my house, on threat of spanking. I never saw that blue van again. I didn't find out until I was 29 exactly how lucky I was that day. After my father's death, I helped my mother clear out his house. While looking through some old boxes, I found an old answering machine, a bunch of tapes, and a tape player as well. Knowing the narcissist my father was, I assumed they must be a combination of old messages from nearly 3 decades ago, and him singing badly and playing the guitar even worse. I took the whole thing home and started to listen to the tapes, mostly for nostalgia. I was half right, but they were not just missed calls from friends and family. I was not in any way prepared for the absolute filth on these old answering machine tapes. I'm not one to blush at bad language. Though I may not use some of the words I heard myself, it didn't really bother me when others did. But this made me physically sick. Maybe because these messages were all directed at me, at a child version of me. Entire hours-long tapes were filled with this one single man calling over and over. They started with some polite-sounding variation of, "This message is for my name. If you could let her know, I'd really appreciate it." Afterwards, nothing but graphic, vulgar descriptions of what he planned to do to me step by step. How he wouldn't hurt me too much. He'd make sure to leave me somewhere my parents could find me when he was done. He didn't say whether he meant alive or not either. He called me his girlfriend and talked about how beautiful I was. There were long tributes to my blonde hair and how he planned to cut it off and keep it after he'd defiled me. He'd wash it off first, of course. He wasn't dirty like that. This was, of course, all in the most filthy language you wouldn't even find in porn. The messages stopped abruptly right around when I was 10 years old, though. After that, it was nothing but the usual missed calls again. I don't know what happened to that man. He really didn't sound like the kind of person to just go and give up. Maybe he ended up dead or in jail, but I do know my dad had a tendency of handling things himself. I know of at least 2 other incidents when someone was bothering my mom or me. They stopped after he went to have a talk with them. Looking back, I suspect that my father was a genuine psychopath in a clinical sense. I destroyed those tapes because I didn't want my mother to find them. If she knew, I have no plans to bring it up now. If she didn't, I don't want her to ever know, for her own peace of mind. Honestly, I kinda wish I hadn't found it either. I think my mom must have been bullied or something when she was growing up. I mean, she never really told me as much, but for some reason, she had an awful lot of empathy for one kid in my class that was bullied. Although I didn't even really like him that much, she pretty much forced me to hang out with this guy. His name was Colin, and she made me do it all the time. He didn't really have any friends, so she kinda took it upon herself to force me to be one. She even once made me sleep over at his house. Colin was just kinda weird. He talked to himself a lot and answered himself as well. It made us all think he must be really crazy or something. My other friends gave me a ton of grief for hanging out with him, but what could I do really? I always did what my mom asked of me, even if it wasn't something I really cared to do. When Colin asked me to sleep over at his place, I was unfortunate enough to have my mom in the same room as us. She overheard and answered for me right away. So here I was, losing an entire Saturday night, sleeping over at this weird kid's house. Colin's parents were a bit odd too. They must have known how few friends he had, because they seemed super appreciative I was even hanging out with them at all. They kept on thanking me and offering me anything I wanted to eat. They even let me choose what to watch on television. They just kinda did whatever they could to show me how much they appreciated I was his friend, which meant they probably didn't know he was simply a charity case. When we went to bed, I noticed that Colin had bunk beds. However, rather than take the top bunk, he instead chose to sleep on the floor. When I asked him why, he told me this: "I always have to save the top bunk for the other Colin." When I asked him what he was talking about, he just shrugged and ignored me. He curled up in a sleeping bag and went right to sleep. Well, I'm not really sure how I could possibly fall asleep after hearing that, but eventually I did manage to. I woke up though sometime in the middle of the night when I heard some ominous whispering. Without raising out of bed, I opened my eyes and looked over at Colin. He was sitting up in his sleeping bag, rocking back and forth. While he rocked, he kept on whispering unintelligible things. I was used to knowing that this kid talked to himself all the time, but this was so much creepier. He just kept on whispering, all while dramatically swaying forwards and backwards on the floor. My God, I thought to myself, something really is wrong with this guy. I closed my eyes and tried to make myself fall back asleep. Somehow, I managed to once again. The next time I woke up, though, it was unclear at first as to what had woken me up. It was still dark when I opened my eyes, but I almost jumped out of my skin. Colin was sitting right at the edge of the bed, staring over me with a huge smile on his face. I asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't answer me. He just sat there and continued to stare. He didn't even blink a single time. I kept asking him if something was wrong, but he just smiled and didn't seem to have any clue I was trying to interact with him. I closed my eyes and prayed this was just a dream. While I laid there, I honestly felt this kid was some sort of psychotic or something. I didn't really know what I could do. If I told his parents I wanted to go home, well, what could I tell them that would convince them to let me? My mom, of course, would also be pissed at me for not spending the entire night. With how she acted, you can of course imagine that she wouldn't believe a single thing I told her. She'd just think I was prejudging the poor kid like everyone else did. I closed my eyes for a long time, trying to ignore everything and imagine it was just a dream. If I ever did fall back asleep, it surely wasn't a restful one, although I can't remember doing so. What caused me to finally open my eyes once again, though, was a kicking sound on the top bunk. I thought to myself that Colin must have climbed up on top because this other Colin he had mentioned made him. I heard 10 kicks before I started to get annoyed. I opened my eyes and shouted for him to stop. "Stop what?" Colin groggily asked me. I froze when I noticed the voice was coming from the floor. I looked over and saw Colin was sleeping in a sleeping bag. I immediately jumped out of the bed, almost like how someone would jump away from a spider or something. I didn't see anyone on the top bunk, though. Colin shook his head, and he seemed to immediately understand. "Oh, just go back to bed. I think he'll leave you alone now." I didn't want to get back in that bed. I chose to sleep on the floor far away from everything. I tried to get Colin to talk about what that was, but he just fell asleep and refused to talk to me. I couldn't fall asleep at all, though. I laid there all night, looking at the top bunk and wondering what just happened. I can't claim that my memory of what happened that night is perfect, though. There's a possibility that Colin's weird behavior before simply made me imagine the sounds. I don't really know, but I can sure as hell tell you that I stopped hanging out with Colin, even though my mom did get really pissed with me. When I was 12, I had a really scary encounter when I was spending the night at my friend Jenny's house. It was a Friday night. Although it was set up as a supervised sleepover with Jenny's mom there, at about 8 p.m., her mom got called into work suddenly. She was a nurse, so it wasn't really unusual for this to happen, and it wasn't unusual either for Jenny to spend a lot of time home alone, even at her young age. Jenny's mom just gave us the normal rules. Stay up on the second floor as much as possible, and if anyone comes to the door, just pretend that no one was home. We didn't mind having the place to ourselves for many reasons, least of all that we were able to stay up as late as we wanted and do whatever we wanted to do. Around 10 p.m., we were still up in Jenny's room watching television when we heard someone ringing the doorbell. We weren't really expecting to hear that so late at night. Of course, we were very curious as to who this could possibly be. We also knew what the rules were, though, so we didn't just go to answer the door right away. It was hard not to, because whoever it was kept ringing the bell over and over again, very frantically. It was nearly 5 minutes of ringing before it stopped as abruptly as it had started. We were both still very curious as to who the hell that was, but now we didn't really concern ourselves too much. That is, until about half an hour later, when the doorbell began to frantically ring again. It startled us, as we hadn't expected the person to come back. Even this time, the doorbell rang over and over again for nearly 15 minutes. It was unnerving. I'm not even sure if I can tell you exactly how it felt. It was nerve-wracking to hear the doorbell over and over again, knowing we couldn't go down to answer the door no matter what. Honestly, we didn't even think it was a good idea to sneak a peek out the window and see who it was, just on the off chance they might see us. We also couldn't make the ringing stop, and we really wanted it too. When it finally did stop for the second time, we were already so wound up that it was hard for us to relax. Jenny tried calling her mom, but being a nurse, it was very often difficult to get in touch with her while she was working. We left a message for her to get back with us as soon as she could, but there was really no telling when that might be. For a while afterwards, we were just very uneasy, but the ringing did not come again. I can't explain why we felt like that, other than it was simply the fact we didn't know who it was that was driving us crazy. At some point, I began to get very thirsty. It must have been the nerves from what was happening, but I felt my mouth getting drier and drier until I knew I would have to go downstairs and grab something to drink. By the time me and her finally braved the trip downstairs together, it had been nearly an hour and a half since the second time we'd heard the doorbell ring. Walking down the stairs was a bit of a chore. With every step, I expected the doorbell to suddenly start ringing again, or for something to jump out in front of us and grab our feet as we were walking down. We, however, made it all the way down to the bottom without a single incident. Finally realizing that whoever it was must be long gone and we were surely safe, Jenny and I went into the kitchen, grabbed ourselves a drink, and took a couple of minutes to make a snack. We were soon about to get ready to head back upstairs. I noticed, though, that Jenny had stopped now. She was looking right past me at the back door. When I turned around, I almost had a heart attack when I saw a man silently standing there, leaning against the window and holding a knife against the window glass. I screamed, but Jenny did the smarter thing. She ran over to the house phone, picked it up, and called 911. "I'm calling the cops, you asshole!" The guy just smiled and pressed his face into the glass. He chuckled, then gave the window a kiss before running off into the night. The police were able to get a hold of Jenny's mom, and she came home, but there was no one anywhere to be found. Seeing that guy was startling enough, but that's not the thing that scared me the most. The thing that terrified me the most was the fact this guy must have not only known we were home, but that we were home alone as well. The ring of the doorbell must have been done deliberately to make us uneasy. How long had he been patiently waiting and watching for us where he was watching from? I don't know. I was stalked by a guest in my student accommodation. I'm 19 years old and living far from home in a studio room. I'm often up late, and last week I was doing some laundry at around 11 p.m.-ish. I saw a man sitting in the lobby. I'd seen him around a bit at night before, but I didn't really ever think too much of him. There I was in the laundry room. I just put my clothes in the dryer, and I heard the laundry room door beeping. That meant someone was currently coming in. There I saw the man, standing there with no clothes to wash, just staring at me from the doorway. I maneuvered around him and headed to the lifts, and he followed quickly behind me. He cornered me and asked me for my Snapchat. I was tired and just wanted to get back to my room, so stupidly, I gave it to him. I figured he'd message and try to flirt, and I'd simply say, "I have a boyfriend. Sorry if you thought this was anything else." Surely that would be the end of it. Anyway, almost right away he started messaging me. It was kind of normal at first. Then he started to say the real weird stuff. "I saw you a month ago, you know. I was really impressed. I've been visiting a friend and staying here so I can see you. I've been watching you. I notice you come out mostly at night. Why is that?" He told me he would be sticking around for 5 more days. Then it started to get worse. "I love you. I can't help it." When I told him I had a boyfriend, he said, "But I only want you." He continued to ignore what I'd said. He asked to come to my room, and I of course said no. Then he asked me to give him a hug. He asked me if I lived alone, if I was a virgin. He kept on repeating that he loved me so much, and he knew I was perfect for him, that I'd really impressed him. At that point, I recorded all the messages I could on Snapchat. I spoke to him a little bit more to gather some evidence so I could take it down to reception in the morning. He'd been watching me for the entire month. I got my friend who lives on the second floor to walk me down to the laundry room, and we sat in the student lounge area. My friend tried to calm me down. I could see him walking around the laundry room, looking for me, but luckily I'd already picked up my things, and he didn't seem to notice me. I ran back to my room. My friend offered me to stay in his room, but I said it was okay since I could just lock my door. At around 1 a.m. though, I heard someone outside my room trying to pick the lock. I asked my friend if he was outside, and he said no. I froze. I didn't want to make a sound. I felt sick to my stomach and helpless. Eventually, when they were unsuccessful, whoever it was took off running. In the morning, I reported this to reception and then went to stay a few days with my boyfriend. Then after, I went to London to visit a friend. Last night was the first time I'd spent a night in my room since this happened. I'm very paranoid now, and sadly, I should probably be used to this. It's not the first time I've had someone stalk me. One guy even followed me into the club and tried to grab my head, and a bunch of other things have happened as well that I won't go through. Anyway, I'm terrified to go outside my room after dark, and I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling paranoid that man will appear once again. I live in a major metropolitan area, DC, and try to practice keen situational awareness and stay aware of any present danger. Alright, that was putting it lightly. To be honest, I've seen some scary shit and become paranoid as fuck because of it. I'm a fairly petite person already, who's looked 16 for the past decade and is therefore an easy target for creeps. Depending on what part of the city I'm going to, or how late I plan to be out, I sometimes strap a fixed blade to myself. I conceal it under my pants or in my boot in the winter, and in summer I either strap it to my arm or somewhere around my waist. It's not exactly the most comfortable, but you can never be too prepared. It was raining on this night. I was wearing an oversized retro windbreaker that I had just found at the thrift store. The knife was tucked away in my purse. The humid DC summer made my skin sticky, and the thought of having a sheath around my arm was very unappealing. I got onto the metro towards home, but the conductor announced that the train was going to go out of service on the stop just before mine. One of my buddies lived 2 blocks away from that metro stop, so I texted him, seeing if he wanted me to stop by and smoke him up for a bit. He responded, saying he would be on his balcony, and I could stop by and just yell for him to let me into the building whenever I came. On the train, I usually listen to music, read, crochet, or stare out the window with regular intervals of casing the train for any sketchy shit. Once in a blue moon, people get robbed on the metro, and if I see packs of teens or people moving up and down the aisle without sitting down, I pack up and tuck my bag underneath myself. It was right before rush hour, and the train was fairly full this time. I didn't really sense anything unusual until I noticed a guy who looked sort of out of place, sitting just across the aisle and facing me. DC has people from all over, and people rarely, if ever, stand out to me as looking suspicious, but something about this guy was easily triggering my spidey senses. The man was abnormally skinny and had greasy dark hair. Looked sort of Eastern European, I'd guess. He was wearing a purple button-down and some tight pants, and kept talking on the phone while checking another phone in his lap. I speak Spanish and a bit of Russian, so I can get the gist of some similar languages. I could tell he appeared to be speaking in some sort of Italian, describing a small female with brown hair and a jacket. He also kept saying sola, which really got my attention, as that means alone in many languages. I started to get a bit anxious at that point. My heart pounded harder every time he looked in my direction. Best case scenario, he was some slimy dude describing me to his friends, but life is too short to count on the best case scenario. I placed my bag in my lap and discreetly strapped the knife to my arm underneath the sleeve of my jacket, just in case. I texted my friend to see if he could meet me at the station itself, so I wouldn't have to walk there alone. The reception on the train was bad though, and the text never went through. When the train arrived at my stop, I tried to wait until the very last second to get off, so the man wouldn't follow me. The doors closed a second or two right behind me, but the skinny dude managed to slip right through them because of his abnormal skinniness. I started picking up the pace and tried to get lost in the crowd on the way to pay my fare. Once I had paid, I started booking it to my friend's place. I tried not to run too fast to make myself less visible. I turned around and saw that no one seemed to be behind me, but I couldn't relax until I'd arrived at my friend's apartment. There was a big burly guy who lived near my friend's building and would blast 80s jams and work out on his porch every evening. I prayed he would still be out there by the time I passed by his house, so I could chill there for a second and call my friend. I walked by, but unfortunately the man didn't seem to be working out tonight. I heard footsteps behind me and turned around. Just as I'd feared, the purple shirt man was following me, and he was swiftly gaining on me. I started to run, and in my panic, I didn't realize there was a car stopped in the middle of the road a few feet ahead of me, with the side door wide open. The guy caught up to me and lunged his hands around my waist. He was surprisingly strong for such a skinny guy. In one of what is probably the most crucial decisions of my life, I slipped the knife out from its sheath and stabbed wherever I could, flailing to get free. I heard fabric rip. The serrated knife had gotten caught on his shirt. I used the leverage of him gripping me to actually aim this time. I slammed the knife under his button-down and pushed it in as hard as I could. I had never been more aware of how fundamentally defenseless I am than that moment. I couldn't even scream or make a sound at all. It was like I had gone completely mute or was holding my breath or something. I have no idea how deeply I'd stabbed the man or how injured he was. Honestly, I didn't care. He dropped me in an instant, and I ran across the street, almost getting hit by a passing car. I sprinted up to my friend's apartment. I noticed an empty cop car sitting next to my friend's building, and this made me even more paranoid. At the time, and probably still, my gut instinct was the police would care more about me having a knife on me than almost getting kidnapped. My friend buzzed me into his building, and I went inside, going straight to his bathroom without even saying hello. I washed the blood off my knife and the scrapes I had gotten in the struggle. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for some reason, I decided not to tell my friend what just happened. I sat with him on his balcony and hung out and laughed as if nothing had ever happened. I can't tell if it was simply shock or just being so desensitized from the city. But to this day, I still occasionally have moments where I realize the gravity of what happened that day. Writing it out helps me wake up a bit. To the psycho in the purple button-down, I'm not really sorry I stabbed you. I hope it went in real deep. I lived the summer camp cliché when I was a child. You've probably seen it in movies or on television, perhaps. A kid doesn't want to go to camp and whines and cries until his parents finally send him away. Once the kid gets there, he doesn't really enjoy it at first, but eventually he gets caught up in all the fun, and then summer camp becomes such a part of his life that he doesn't even want to go home when his parents come to get him. Honestly, that's kind of exactly what happened to me. However, when the time came for my parents to grab me, I was all too eager to head home. It's not that I didn't enjoy being at camp either. I absolutely did. We made crafts, went on hikes, and even had an archery tournament. Although if you've never shot a bow and arrow before, you kinda don't realize how hard it actually is. That didn't matter though. I was having so much fun that I even enjoyed the food. I think what really got me into enjoying it so much was the cabin I was staying in. There were 10 boys in it. We all had 2 bunks. At night, we would play these little games, mostly truth or dare sorts. You get a bunch of 12 and 13-year-old boys in a cabin by themselves, and generally the last thing any of them wants to do is go to sleep. Us boys would of course ask each other naughty questions, to which everyone else would always answer with a bunch of lies. We'd also dare each other to do dumbass things, like crawl across all the tops of the bunks without hitting the floor. One kid was even dared to hump a pillow, and in order to not lose any face, he did just that right in front of everyone. It was a hot night one evening, and we were just playing around like usual. This boy Pete had his turn, and asked me if I wanted a truth question or to take a dare. I chose dare. I wasn't really good at making up lies for those truth questions. His dare was really weird though. He dared me to switch beds with him. I had a top bunk in the middle of the cabin, and he had the bottom bunk just off to the side. I figured he only dared me because he wanted to sleep on the top. I accepted his dare, and in a way felt a bit relieved he hadn't asked me to do anything more serious. When I took my things and climbed into his bed, I wondered why this kid had given up such a comfortable spot. I mentioned before it was a really hot night. We were in summer camp cabins, so we didn't have AC or fans. The only way we could keep cool was by keeping the windows to the cabin open. The bed he'd traded me for was right next to one of them. It was the ideal spot. I was not sure how much longer we fooled around playing, but eventually we all headed to sleep. I fell asleep as well, even though I can't even remember trying to, and I was dreaming before I knew it. Suddenly though, I felt something grab me in my dream. I recall being very confused at first. It was an uncomfortable enough feeling that it caused me to wake up immediately. My head was hurting, and I quickly realized that someone was grabbing me by the hair and trying to pull me out through the cabin window. I tried to look up to see who this was, but all I could make out was a large shadow of someone pulling my hair extremely hard. I started screaming and woke up the entire cabin. I screamed as loud as I could. This person was really tugging my hair, and my head was already out the window. He was trying to pull me out with him. The other kids in the cabin were wide awake now, and when they realized what was happening, they ran out to grab some of the counselors. The counselors didn't get there fast enough for me. The man managed to get me halfway out of the window as I continued to scream. Then I caught sight of his face. He was nasty looking, covered in boils and dirt, no teeth at all. He was scowling at me, with his mouth clenched like he was extremely angry. It made no sense as to why he'd be attacking me. Just before he got me all the way out the window, two of the counselors arrived and tackled the man like high school football players. I got free of his grip. They then proceeded to beat the ever-loving shit out of the guy as I climbed back in through the window. The counselors really went to town on that man. The police were called, and they eventually took the extremely roughed-up man away. When the counselors and the police were talking to us about what happened, one of the counselors asked why I wasn't in my assigned bed. I explained to him the truth or dare game and told him that Pete had asked me to switch beds that night. Pete, when asked why he did this, simply told the other counselors, "Well, I saw a scary man hiding in the trees. He was watching the cabin, and I didn't want to be in my bed right next to the window, so I traded beds with someone else. Pete, you're a dickhead." The scariest thing that ever happened to me happened while I was at summer camp. I used to go there every summer. I'm a boy, and I really enjoyed it. I looked forward to it as well, and when my parents dropped me off, I was so excited I barely even said goodbye to them. I ran off immediately to try and get myself involved in the various activities. When I was 15 years old, I even got the opportunity to be a counselor myself. It was great, actually. I had been going there yearly and knew the place inside and out. I was generally seen as pretty responsible. Being a counselor meant I was allowed to take out canoes whenever I wanted to. I especially loved canoeing, so this was a really big plus for me. Being a counselor, though, was much harder work than I'd initially thought it would be. A lot of the younger boys were brats, of course, and it was difficult trying to control so many kids at once. I had to break up several fights and make sure kids were going to bed when they were supposed to, and help care for them when they got hurt. I also had to make all their schedules as well. It was real tough work. I guess I never realized that I was just like them when I was their age. I finally got a break one day when I asked to be let off the nature hike roster. I had been working so hard that the supervisors decided I needed some rest. I decided I was going to spend the day doing the only thing I could do that would get me completely away from any kids. I decided to go out on the canoe. The camp that I worked in was by this nice, beautiful, long river. No sooner had I set out, making sure I was going the opposite way of the nature hikes, than I felt a supreme sense of relief. The trees were so beautiful on each side of the river, and I got such a good view of the many hills around the camp. The water was calm and still that day too, so it was a very easy-going experience. I was now alone in this empty area. It was pretty quiet for the most part, other than the frequent buzzing of what I assume were cicadas, or the occasional cry of a loon. Loon cries can be a bit unnerving if you've never heard one, but at least I could figure out what they were. With the echoing sound of the river valley, though, it made their cries seem so much more eerie. When I had been rowing for a long time, I began to hear a different noise. It sounded as if someone were possibly chopping a tree or something. I was surprised when I heard this, but I wasn't really worried. If I had accidentally wandered onto anyone's property, I would just explain myself and leave right away. My canoe began getting closer and closer to the noise as I kept on rowing. Eventually, I was able to hear the original sound. It was definitely someone chopping something. I became intrigued. Maybe someone was building something out here. It wasn't too long before I eventually was able to make out some movement up ahead of me. There was someone in the woods on the left side of the forest, but I couldn't quite tell what they were doing. At first, I tried to make it out by just squinting, but then I recalled that I'd brought some binoculars with me. I took them out. This was a bit of a pain. Obviously, it's difficult to look through a pair of binoculars while also trying to control a canoe. In fact, it gave me a bit of motion sickness. Eventually, though, I did get a view of the man who was up on the hill. He appeared to be chopping a log on the ground. I realized it was nothing too important, but figured the man probably owned the area and decided to go ahead and turn back around. However, just before I had decided to put my binoculars down, I saw him swing the axe into this log. Then he moved away. I had to do a double take to make sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. There was a man lying on the log, with the axe firmly embedded in his chest. I dropped the binoculars into the canoe, afraid for my own safety. The man was pretty far away, but if I could see him through the trees with my binoculars, it was possible he could see me way out in the open on the river. I was thankful the river was calm at least, as I frantically paddled my way back towards the camp. The return trip was a nightmare. The peaceful sounds I'd heard on my way down the river no longer seemed so peaceful. Every loon cry made my heart jump. Every sound of an animal moving through the trees made my heart race. I kept on thinking it could be that man, that he knew I'd seen what he was doing. If he was willing to do that to whoever that person was, what was he willing to do to me? It took me a few hours to get back, but boy was I so relieved when I did. I told my supervisors what I'd seen, but they immediately dismissed me. They told me I'd probably misconstrued what was going on. I was looking through binoculars on a canoe through trees, to be fair. Besides, it would be nearly impossible to find someone in those hills if something really had happened. A bit cavalier if you ask me, but I really had no choice but to accept what they told me. I did continue going back to summer camp until I went off to college, but I never again went off on my own for any reason. So this story was originally submitted in Japanese by a friend on one of my Japanese horror sites. What follows is my best translation of the story. It's somewhat weird because it happened in an abandoned summer camp in Fukushima, Japan. What's even weirder is that I didn't know it was abandoned when I initially set out for it. I had been looking for Takaka no Numa Amusement Park, a really famous abandoned park in the area. I had become completely obsessed with it many years ago, when I had run across some pictures of it online. I live in Iwaki, which is a coastal town in Fukushima. I had never been to this amusement park before, and didn't know anyone else who had been either. Because of this, I didn't really know exactly where it was. There was a bit of an urban legend, you see, that it was impossible to find. If you entered the coordinates on Google Earth, you would not find anything. I've since learned that that's because the park was simply demolished. Well, that information may have helped me those many years ago, but it doesn't really help me too much now that I know it now. I would take these excursions out into the hilly area around which the amusement park was said to have stood. It was easy enough to do, as there were no barriers preventing me from going off the street into the hills and searching around. I was exploring, and I got particularly excited when I came across what looked like a bunch of abandoned old cabins. I thought I was on to the first signs of something. I was, however, disappointed when I realized it had nothing to do with the amusement park. It was simply an old, abandoned summer camp out in the woods. Well, perhaps it would be exciting to see an abandoned camp as well. This sort of thing is definitely not common in Japan. Despite my initial disappointment, I decided to go and check out this new discovery, and it was pretty interesting. There were a good 15 buildings altogether, so not a particularly large area. There was what looked to be an office, a cafeteria, some cabins, and a few buildings that I couldn't quite discern the nature of. The camp itself must have been very old, too, because the forest had grown over it quite thoroughly. Large trees had grown in the walkways, and bushes and very tall grass covered everything else. It was the sort of scenery you'd expect to see in a very scary movie. I went into one of the cabins, surprised to find that the floor was still fairly sturdy. There were several beds in there, and it smelled musty and moldy. I didn't want to stay inside for too long. Then, though, I saw a bit of movement out of the corner of my eye and stopped in place. There was a very, very skinny old man laying in one of the beds looking directly at me. Oh my God, he was so skinny it looked like he hadn't eaten anything in months. His hair was long and unkempt, and his clothing was ratty and full of holes. It consisted of nothing more than a dirty and ripped-up pair of slacks and a nasty, stained tank top. His eyes were wide open, bulging out of his head, and they looked extremely angry. The man began to make this strange noise, sort of an enraged, gurgling yell. He shot up from the bed, then stood still, screaming at me. It was so weird. It was like he didn't even need to breathe. He didn't come at me at first, but began to wildly look around the area. I didn't know what he was doing at first, but I soon figured out he seemed to be looking for a weapon or something. While he was doing so, he kept angrily screaming until he grabbed a large rusty machete and picked it up. I turned tail and ran. I sprinted out of the cabin, out of the camp, and was all the way out before turning back and looking. The man was standing outside, watching me, still screaming and holding that machete. Fortunately, the man was very skinny and weak, and so had no chance of keeping up with me. I kept on running until I was out of the woods, and arrived back at my car. All of this because I was looking for an old abandoned amusement park. My parents sent me to summer camp every summer. I liked it well enough, but I assumed they sent me there to make their lives easier. They probably saw it as a summer babysitting job, but a parent should always make sure their babysitters are capable of fully protecting their children before sending them away. I began going to camp as soon as I was old enough to do so. I got really used to spending a large portion of my summer sleeping in a cabin with no air conditioning, no television, and 9 other boys who were roughly my age. I was always able to fall asleep pretty easily in the muggy and often noisy cabin. During a particular summer when I was 13 years old, though, I had a pretty awful experience. There were 5 bunk beds in the cabin, each set along the walls. There were 2 on the back wall and 1 on each of the other walls. This summer, I was sleeping in the bottom bunk on the side wall. Though I had fallen asleep rather quickly, I was woken up suddenly in the middle of the night and saw something I couldn't quite make out at first. Keep in mind, I was very groggy, and the unbelievably humid air in the cabin didn't help me wake up any faster. We did have some fans set in there, but they didn't really do a whole lot to help. It was very dark, but I could see what looked like the shadow of an adult figure standing across the room. It was at the bed just parallel to my own. I couldn't make out who this was, but they were fairly tall. They could easily see up to the top bunk without any real effort. He was also doing something with his hand. I assumed he was nudging the person in the bed to check and see if he was awake. I thought it must have been one of the counselors, and didn't think too much more about it. I turned around and adjusted the sheets off my feet, and pretty quickly fell back asleep. The next day, I was assigned to do some activities with the kid who had been sleeping in that bunk. His name was Alan. In the light of the day, my mind was much clearer, and I was having a lot of weird feelings about what I'd seen the night before. My first thought was that one of the camp counselors must have been molesting Alan. His presence in the cabin and the movements by the bed made it seem possible. But if that were the case, Alan didn't seem to be acting like anything bad had happened. In fact, he was in an excellent mood, and we had a lot of fun together that day. The following night, though, I made the same observation again. I once again woke up in the middle of the night and saw that same tall, dark figure standing next to Alan's bunk. He looked again like he was trying to nudge Alan to see if he was awake. This time, I was a bit put off by what I was seeing. I was in fact worried that whatever the guy was doing to Alan, he might do it to everyone else too, and maybe even hurt Alan. I made it a point that I was going to ask Alan the following day about what this guy's deal was, and maybe see if we needed to talk to another counselor together. When morning came, I was the first one to get up. I immediately remembered seeing what was happening the previous night, and ran to Alan's bed to wake him up and talk about it. When I got up though, I looked over at Alan's bunk, and saw it was now empty. I was immediately alarmed, because his bed was not made either. We were required to make our beds before leaving the cabin in the morning, and Alan was always a stickler for the rules. I ran immediately to talk to my counselor. I was worried whoever had been in the cabin that night must have taken Alan. The counselor hadn't seen him, and contacted camp security, but Alan was nowhere to be found. He didn't show up at any of the events that day. He was simply gone. The surrounding forest was searched, in case he'd simply wandered out and gotten lost. Or, in the worst case, if something else had happened. But no one ever found him. Even now, many years later, I have no idea what happened to Alan. I've dealt with immeasurable amounts of guilt for not getting up that night to confront the man and see what was really happening. Obviously, whoever that guy was, he took Alan away. Maybe I would have been able to stop it if I'd gotten up and said something to the man. I'm sorry, Alan. Right on the outside of town, there's an old railroad track. At this time, I had lived in this town for about 10 years. I could count on my hands how many times I'd actually seen a train moving on it. However, right after a bridge, there was another off-track. I'm not really sure what you'd call it. There were often train cars parked there for a really long period of time. The area around there was very heavily wooded. There was a road that went through it and up a hill as well. There were a few houses up there, but very spread apart. I would often take that road because it was a shortcut to get back home, and it led to a field as well. That's how I knew about the train cars that were often parked there. I was walking with a friend one day when he decided he wanted to take some pictures of those train cars. He was designing some sort of game, I believe, and felt he needed pictures to model off of. After taking pictures of some of the back cars, he wanted to walk to the ones in front as well. We had been snapping photos for a good 15 minutes at that point. As we started walking forward, though, we noticed something. Someone snuck out from between two of the cars and then started to walk in our direction. I can't explain why, but seeing this guy made us both feel very uncomfortable right away. There were rarely any people back in that area. I asked my friend if maybe we should just go now. For some reason, the appearance of the guy who was a bit far from us was making him feel uneasy too. We decided to just leave and come back at a later time. About a week later, he and I went on another walk. We decided to take that back road again. He needed to take some more pictures. Same train was there, but that's not a big surprise. It would sit there for months at a time. We were going to try to go to the front of the train again and take those pictures of the front cars we didn't get last time. As we began walking in that direction, though, it happened again. A guy just came out of nowhere from between two of the cars. It could have been the exact same one from the first time. Once again, there was something very creepy feeling about the whole thing. My friend and I decided to just leave again. We talked about it for a while and came to a simple conclusion. There must have been some homeless people sleeping in those cars or something. We figured for that reason he must have been living in between them maybe. Perhaps he just didn't want anyone snooping around his living area. We decided that maybe we'd just stop bothering him and stop trying to get those pictures. We kept away from that train area for quite a while. My friend was really stubborn though, and really wanted those pictures of that train. After a period of time, we decided it had probably been long enough, and we wanted to go back. My friend was taking pictures, going further down the track than we had before. Since the man hadn't come out yet, we figured he'd moved on since then. My friend started going between the cars to get pictures that he needed. This happened so quick that it took me by complete surprise. The man just suddenly pounced out from behind one of the cars, screaming all sorts of gibberish. He was holding what looked like a knife in his hand, and he began to sprint towards my buddy. My friend was closer to the man than I was. He fell over in surprise. The crazy man easily jumped on him and held him down. My friend was struggling to get up. I hate to admit, but I almost ran away in fear. I knew I had to help my friend somehow, though. I ran over there and tried my best to pull this guy off of him. The man was a lot stronger than I'd thought, though. With the combined strength of me and my buddy, we were just barely able to push him off. The guy stumbled backwards and fell down. I tried my best to heave my friend to his feet. By the time he was up, the crazy man was up too. This was the first time I got a look at him. His eyes were chilling to me. They made Norman Bates look normal. His face was covered in blood. It was only then that I realized he'd actually bitten my friend. It was too much. The two of us took off running. The man chased after us with his knife, but fortunately only as far as the end of the train. We were able to get out of there safely from that point on. My friend had been bitten so bad he had to go to the hospital. The police went and arrested the man who attacked us. They found tons of dead animals in the area where he'd been hiding. It looked like he'd been eating some of them. He went to jail for the attack. 3 years for aggravated assault. The two of us, though, were stuck with the memory. Okay, so this happened to me when I was around 18 or 19 and just started college in a small town in the South. I had a pretty terrible college experience in general, but this just added to the shit show that was my first year. To set the scene, I lived in a sweet building with a parking garage attached to it. There were probably 4 or 5 levels to this garage, and the top level was at ground level. The sweet building was about a 5-minute walk down a sidewalk to the entrance. There was also a little room with windows that housed the elevator nearby the sidewalk. My boyfriend at the time lived off campus, and I hated being on campus so much that I spent a lot of time at his house in a neighboring town. I did have an 8 a.m. class though, so I would usually at least go back to my suite at some point in the night or early morning if I could. One night, I'd just gotten back at around 2 a.m. The parking garage was pretty full on this night, and I had to park at the furthest end of the building, closer to the ramp that went to the lower levels. Closer to the ramp that went down to the lower levels. I'm terrified of being inside parking garages for long times, so usually I'd always park at the top. It was pretty dark out. I would also usually call my sister or my boyfriend if I was spooked. This night was pretty normal though, so I didn't really feel the need to bother them yet. I was almost to the sidewalk when I noticed someone in the little room where the elevator was. They had been hidden behind a wall, but after I passed them by, I saw them emerge. It seemed he'd come out as soon as he thought I wouldn't notice him, since I wasn't able to see him through the windows there. I didn't get a great look at him, but I could tell it was a middle-aged man. I found it quite odd such a person would be on campus so late at night, and in the building where there were mostly only young people and freshmen as well. I tried my best to just ignore this person and continue on my way. As I reached the nearby sidewalk though, about 20 feet away, I could see he was more brazenly following me now, walking right behind me. I tried my best to be rational and not freak out. The further I walked though, the more I realized he was now gaining on me. There was one of those posts nearby where you could hit a button for campus police, but something inside of me told me that I had to not let him know I knew he was there, and that he was also scaring me. In a few seconds' time, I had to make a decision. I started to sprint down the sidewalk. Right from behind me, I could hear him pick up speed and start running on the pavement as well. He was chasing me. There were 3 entrances to this building. Usually I used the furthest one because my room was on the far side of the building. As soon as I got to this first entrance though, I swiped my card as fast as possible, threw open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. The man was right there, right on the other side of that door. He made eye contact with me for a while, then turned and sprinted the other way and out of view. I was so fucking scared that night, and still to this day. I wonder what his intentions really were. Probably for the best I never had to find out. The very next morning, I woke up to an emergency email about a strange man that had been spotted on campus the previous night. Still gives me creeps whenever I think about it. I lived in Wisconsin and worked at a covert restaurant when I had this horrible experience. At the time, I had an old clunker for a car. It would get me to and from work, sure, but it was one of those cars that every time you drove it, you just knew something was eventually going to happen. You always just hoped that when it did, it was going to be nice outside at least. Of course, that's never how it actually works out. The day I finally had the problem with my car, it was definitely not a nice day. It had been snowing hard all day long, and the ride to work had been bad enough. This day just got worse and worse. While I was working the closing shift, I don't think the entire 9 hours I was at work the snow even slowed down once. It was just constant, even though the plows had been running all day long. They could only do so much before the roads just ended up covered once they left. We closed at 10 p.m. or so, and it took us another 45 minutes to clean up the store. There was one coworker and one manager with me. We locked up all the doors and then went our own ways. It felt quite good to get out of work finally. I knew it would feel even better to get home, but I was not looking forward to the journey there. I lived a good 10 miles away, and in these weather conditions that ride was going to take forever. I had only gotten about halfway there when the very worst thing happened. I blew a tire. I was panicked at first. I was worried I was going to wreck the car due to the lack of traction on the ice. Somehow, though, I managed to pull into the parking lot of a nearby office building. Although I did have a spare, I didn't have a jack or anything to get the lug nuts off the tire apparently. Yeah, I know it's stupid, but I always thought I'd have the time to get those things if I ever needed them. Now I had no idea what I was going to do. There was no way I could just walk home, and I definitely couldn't leave my car here either. Even if I could call a taxi, if I left my car there it might get towed away, and I just could not afford a towing fee right now. I tried my best to get a hold of some friends, but nobody was answering their phone that day. I waited there in my car for a while, just watching the snow fall and wondering what I could do in this situation. I wasn't in the parking lot for more than 15 minutes when an SUV pulled off the road and drove over to me. I was immediately worried I was about to get in some trouble for idling in the parking lot, but I was also hopeful this was just someone trying to help me. A big, husky, bearish-looking man climbed out of this SUV and walked up to my car. He knocked gently on the window, and I rolled it down. "Hey there, need some help changing a tire?" the burly man said. "Yeah, I don't have any jacks or tools on me. I do have the tire, though," I explained to him. The man, as nice as could be, told me he had some tools and would be more than willing to help me change my tire. I'm not a particularly big guy myself, and I'd never had to do it before. This guy seemed thankfully genuinely willing to help me out. He went over to his SUV and got his tools. I thanked him profusely. As he began to change the tire, I got out of the car and stood behind him. I told him from now on I would get the tools, and if this ever happened again, I would be prepared from then on. While the man was explaining to me what to do, though, I caught something in the very corner of my eye. I didn't know what it was at first, but looking back towards that SUV, I saw the scariest thing I'd ever seen in my life. There was a person, bloodied up with duct tape over her mouth, trying to climb into the front of the car. Her hands were duct taped together as well, and her eyes were desperate for help. I was immediately scared to death. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like I could fight this guy. He would tear me apart without even trying. I figured the only thing I could do was not let on that I just noticed her, and memorize his license plate number, call the police when he left. The rest of the tire change was just terrifying. I had no idea what that man was going to do with me. I didn't know if he was just trying to be helpful, or if he wanted to hurt me too. I tried my best not to look nervous, but every time he moved closer, I nearly jumped out of my skin. When he had finally changed the tire and began to lower the car back down, I reached into my pocket and grabbed my car keys. He picked up the jack and asked me to lean over and take a look. I really didn't want to do so, but I did it very slowly while making sure to keep an eye on him. When he saw how slowly I was moving, he picked up his tools and went over to put them in the back of his car. Immediately, I grabbed my keys out of my pocket, threw my door open, and slammed it shut. I looked in the mirror and saw the man had noticed me. He began to move quickly around the SUV. I turned on my own car. Thank God horror movie cliches don't happen in real life. My car started right away. I put it in gear and took off before the man could get to the side of my car. I pulled away, slipping more than once on the ice and almost sending my car spinning. Eventually, I did get away, and it was long before he had a chance to get into his SUV and follow me. I drove straight to the police station to tell them what I'd witnessed. While I was giving my statement, they sent the cars out to the parking lot. They found the girl still duct-taped and nearly naked, lying frozen and covered in snow in the parking lot. The man must have figured he'd gotten caught and dumped her. He probably hadn't figured I'd had the time to memorize his plate numbers. I'm very happy to report the police found him as well. I testified at his trial, and he went to prison. The woman turned out to actually be his girlfriend. She was very convinced he wanted to kill her, and very thankful to me that my tire had gone out that night, and I'd called the police to come help. My first Christmas away at college was a sort of sordid, lonely affair. I didn't have the money to go home and spend Christmas with my family. My college did allow students to stay over in their dorm rooms during holiday break, though. This meant that I stayed in my room for the entire 5 weeks between the 2 semesters. Obviously, not a whole lot of other students did this. This meant that the huge, normally packed campus was basically turned into a winter wasteland. You know, I actually had a lot of problems during this break. I've actually shared a few of them before, but I haven't shared this one yet. First off, I was drinking quite a lot during this time. I didn't really think too much about it, though. I was in college, and it wasn't like it was hurting anyone, so I just did it. My personal drink of choice was vanilla vodka. I can't count how many days and nights I walked down to the store in order to grab some. On Christmas Eve, I was feeling particularly lonely, and I really didn't have much to drink on me. Not only that, I realized the liquor store would be closed on Christmas Day. To be honest, I was surprised that with so few students on campus that the store was even open on Christmas Eve as well. I decided to walk down to the store. Now, if any of you have ever been on a large campus or in a big city when it didn't have many people around, it's a very strange and surreal experience. It kind of makes you a little bit more wary of whatever or whomever you do happen to see. When I walked into the store, I noticed that there was someone leaning against the outside. I was horrified, thinking it must be a homeless man, especially because of just how cold it was outside. I mean, just the wind chill had to be below zero. I went into the store and bought my stuff. Then, when I came out, I observed the guy a bit more closely. The side of the store was an alleyway that he happened to be sitting in. I could tell he was breathing, so he was still alive, thankfully. I really wished I could do something to help him. I felt bad for buying the vodka when I didn't really have money to give, and I could have given him some. I decided to walk home, but it wasn't long before I turned around and looked back at the store. I was feeling a bit bad. I noticed that the guy on the side of the door had gotten up, though. Not only that, but he had begun walking in the direction that I was walking in. I started to get a little bit nervous, especially so when he crossed the street and was on the same side as me now. I began to wonder if he had done that on purpose, because now it was clear he was following me, and I couldn't really think of any good reason to do that. The walk back wasn't a short one either. As I kept on going, I looked back at the guy as he made it obvious he was following me. I didn't assume he was a student either, because he certainly did not look like one. He was battered in old and dirty clothes, which I had noticed when he was sitting against the store. He smelled quite bad too. Anyway, he took every single turn that I took, even ones that didn't lead me directly back to my campus dorm, so there was no doubt he was following me. Now, when we got closer to it, there was a small way I took to get there. I would cut behind this building, walking on earth rather than sidewalk. There were a lot of trees back there, so it was not the most ideal place to walk when someone was following you, but it would cut a few minutes off the travel time. When I got through there, I was in more of an open spot. There was also a light right above as I got back onto the sidewalk. I went to look back again, and at that point I saw the man once more. This time, though, I saw him standing in the light, for really the first time. He was walking a little bit arched over, theatrically swinging his arms back and forth. He seemed to be wearing a Santa hat, and I noticed it looked like he didn't have any hands. It looked like he had hooks instead. In a normal situation, I think that wouldn't bother me much. I mean, I even once worked with a disabled guy who had 2 hooks for hands because he thought it looked cool. But this situation was a bit different. This guy was obviously following me and was swinging those hooks back and forth in what looked like an aggressive manner. Not knowing what else to do, I took off running, and I ran as fast as I could. I didn't even worry I might slip on the ground because of the ice. I did almost fall forward a couple of times, but thankfully I managed to hold my footing. I sprinted all the way back to the dorm. Taking out my card to open the door, I fumbled with it and realized why people from horror movies might fumble with their cards so much. I did manage to get inside and quickly shut it behind me. Looking back, I noticed the man was still out there, but now he had stopped pursuing me. Instead, he was just kinda standing there, a bit far back from the entrance. He was just staring at me. I kept on watching him. Finally, he lifted one of his hooked hands, waved it at me like he was telling me goodbye, and then turned and slowly walked away. I never saw that hooked man again. I don't know if he was wanting to rob me or hurt me, or if he was even just screwing with me because he thought it was funny. I mean, the situation was really out there. I could absolutely believe it was a man who happened to have 2 hooked hands that really wanted to mess with me. I don't know, but it was terrifying when it happened. I went back to my dorm room and had a whole lot of vanilla vodka to celebrate that Christmas Eve. I recently received a friend request that reminded me of this story. This happened after I went to university, so I was about 18 years old at the time. I had made an effort to make friends after I moved onto campus, and ended up with a few groups to hang out with, including a new girlfriend and plenty of people from my classes that I liked well enough. There was one class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterwards to eat in pairs or threes. I wasn't very discerning about who I'd go with, because I got along fine with most people from the class, and we were all sort of trying to make an effort to be social at that age. This meant that when one particular girl, Lily, asked if I wanted to go eat lunch together after that class, I didn't have any reason to refuse. We talked about school and mostly pretty casual stuff, nothing really noteworthy. She did ask me to get lunch with her again the next week, though. Soon it became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no suddenly. It was fine with me, but it did mean I lost the chance to eat lunch with anyone else on those days, which sort of hindered my social life a little. In hindsight, I suppose that was the point, though. One day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media, and this just happened to occur in front of Lily. Immediately, I saw her face jerk towards me from a couple seats over. It was such a sharp reaction that it was hard to ignore. I still remember it even to this day. Needless to say, by the time I'd gotten home later, Lily had already sent me a friend request. We had no friends in common either. I don't even know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess maybe she dug through the university's social media pages and found me through there or something. I did get a bad feeling, but surely this was fine. She ended up messaging me quite a lot and commenting on anything I posted. I told myself she was just awkward. We became friends, if not close, and I'd known worse people. She still always got me to go eat lunch with her after our shared class. Other than that, though, we very rarely had any time together in person. I would see her around sometimes, but I never went out of my way to hang out with her, you know. This meant it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other in group settings. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also called Lily. This was something that clearly bothered the other Lily. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to pick a different name, or joked about it not suiting her. Clearly, she did not like my girlfriend at all, and I had an idea as to why. It was getting hard to ignore by this point. Lily was starting to unsubtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried my best not to address it. I mean, what was I gonna say? I'd never known what to do when a friend tried to make a pass at me. I was also not interested in the very least. Even ignoring some of the weird stuff she did, Lily was just not my type. She tended to act and dress in a way somewhere between a 50s housewife and all those adults still obsessed with Disney princesses, if you can picture that combination. Things took an uncomfortable turn on the day of our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me to lunch like she usually did, she asked if I'd go out for a walk with her. Again, I didn't know how to refuse, so I said a small one would be fine. Our campus was bordered by a large patch of woodland. Lily led me out into the woods, and the sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log and I joined her. She started talking about how much she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried placating her, but I really didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed to be on the verge of tears. I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could say anything, Lily chose to lean in and kiss me without warning. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. I got out of there and was happy to think I would not see her for a while. I came back to university after summer, moving into a house with my friends. Without going off topic, there were some serious issues in that group. Lots of petty arguing, and even worse, I broke up with my girlfriend around the start of that school year as well. Basically, the whole mess made me recontextualize things with Lily. It didn't seem quite so bad after all that drama. That said, I still didn't want to be alone with her. We mostly just talked online. She was still constantly messaging me every day after all. One upside of everything was that I started dating a boy. Lily was not pleased to hear that news. I think she hoped to kinda sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend. but as I said before, that was never going to happen. This is where the story gets bad. At this time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I occasionally talked about my life and mostly just reblogged photos and things I found interesting. I was on there one day when something odd happened. One of the blogs I followed had received an ask with some phrases I recognized. It took a second to register that it was taken from my About page. That made me freeze. I read the message properly. Someone was asking this completely random person to analyze a section of text from my page, asking for their opinion on the type of person who would write it. I cannot stress how messed up it was to see people talking about me like I was a character in a book or something. The important thing, though, was that the question had not been anonymous. It linked to someone's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me in particular. As far as I knew, not a single person in real life knew about my page. It's not like I shared it around or anything. No prizes for guessing who was behind it. What I found was disturbing. It was almost like a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognized Lily all over that thing. It was this cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about her interest, but most of the content was focused on her primary interest, me. Most of the posts were all about me. There were accounts of things I'd done recently, places I'd been, groups I participated in, going to the nightclub recently, as well as references to things as far back as I'd known her. It was clear she'd been keeping tabs on me, both online and offline, gathering every scrap of information she could about my life and hoarding it in this little collection. She talked about us eating lunch together, how special our dates had been to her, as if it was anything more than acquaintances just getting food after class. She even talked about the time she had forcibly kissed me in the woods. She quoted lyrics from all of my favorite songs, even though I'd never talked about them, and talked about how she'd always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me just the way he is as well, which answered another mystery about some anonymous love letters I'd been receiving earlier that year with the same wording. It got worse. There were a lot of posts about my boyfriend as well. Those were not so nice. It was angry and hateful. I didn't like to think of the sort of person who could write so obsessively being fixated on me. One thing that didn't make sense at first was that the blog had also made plenty of references to this best friend, Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me, and I'd never seen anyone else around her either. Her post talked a lot about Steven and how great a friend he was, how much fun they had together, how much he looked out for her. I was trying to work out whether this was an online friend or something, when one specific post made it all click. She had posted a photo and captioned it, "Steven sent this to me. He knew I would like it." The problem was, it was a photo taken straight from my page. I had not sent that to her. She took it from my page and then claimed I was her fictional best friend, because in her head she'd split me into two people, the two most important people in her life. In her messed up fantasies, I was both her perfect best friend and her soulmate who was going to end up with her. Who was she complaining to? Oh, she had an audience all right. People who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of random people agreeing with this stalker, things like my boyfriend didn't deserve me, we were bound to break up soon, I would be with Lily, the person I was clearly destined to be with. She had this fake fanfiction version of my life up for anyone to share their opinion on, and she made herself out to be the hero of it all, of course. I had only gone maybe a month back into this page's history, and I didn't look at everything that was there. It was too much, and I didn't want to see if there was anything from before I'd known her. Needless to say, I sent Lily a message confronting her about this blog. She said nothing. I can't stress how weird it was to have found pages and pages dedicated to me. Then she just acted like it never happened. She said nothing. Didn't even address it, just changed the subject like I'd never even said it, like she hadn't even registered that it existed. I've never seen deflection quite like it. Well, of course, afterward she deleted the page, or at least changed the name and hid it because I could never find it again. That was not the end, though. I was not going to hang out with her anymore, but we were still shoved together in classes. She had started to actually scare me with what she might do next. I'm kind of a paranoid person already, so knowing someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long really scared me a lot. The next thing she pulled was trying to seduce my boyfriend. That was a useless attempt. What was her plan there? Did she hope to tell me he cheated and wait for me to break up with him or something? Why would I want her after that? When that didn't work, she tried to seduce all of my friends. None of them took the bait, thankfully. She ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but made sure to send me messages every day while they were together, letting me know she'd rather be with me instead. Lily made sure to stay in my life the entire time I was at university. There was a time when I tried to pull away from her, and she ended up starting these malicious rumors about me and damaging a career opportunity I'd put a lot of time into. I don't know all of what she did behind my back, but it made me realize it might be safer to just let her think she was a part of my life while ignoring her, rather than do something that would cause her to get angry. I knew at this point she really didn't have any reservations about hurting me to get what she wanted. After I graduated, Lily of course still wanted to hang around me, but now I didn't have that additional impetus of school keeping me there. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after that point. I had entirely stopped posting on social media I knew she knew about. Of course, she would not give up that easily. Usually, I ignored all of her attempts though. I didn't think she was still tracking me online, but in hindsight, she probably was. I don't know how, but she'd reference things I mentioned online somewhere else she couldn't have known about. The last time we had a conversation for real, she sent me a message out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken at all in months, and we hadn't talked about anything serious in much longer than that. Thinking about that conversation still makes my skin crawl. At first, she asked me some questions about how long I'd known I was queer. I told her some basic stuff, the kind of things I'd tell anyone who asked. Then she changed the subject. She started talking about how I would feel about her if she was a boy, about wanting to be a boy for me. The messages quickly became fetishistic. Again, we were not even friends at this point. We'd never been especially close, and we'd barely spoken for years. I can't imagine sending messages like that even to a close friend, let alone someone who barely knew you. I tried telling her not to pull this crap with me, and then she decided to change tactics. She started role-playing as me. The worst part is that she seemed to believe it was real, that those things had actually happened to her, even when she was quoting me word for word. Things I'd told her only hours before were now part of her life. It was like she was trying to absorb me or something, to take over my history, to make my life a part of her. Yeah, I really didn't want to talk to her again after that. I ignored future attempts she made and eventually silently deleted her from the inactive social media, which was her only real way of contacting me. I really thought she might finally move on. But then I started getting more friend requests on everywhere. They're still sitting there unanswered because I know if I delete them, she'll somehow find a way to seek me out elsewhere. Lily and I met nearly 12 years ago. This story is just the highlights, and even then, it's only the stuff I knew about for sure. A lot happened behind my back. I just know it did. I hated going to summer camp. I mean, I really hated it. It wasn't the actual camp or the activities or anything like that was unlikable. I also didn't hate being away from my parents. I didn't even hate being out in the woods, really. The reason I didn't like summer camp was because I just didn't fit in. I was a nerdish, shy, and bookish type, and I wore some very dorky glasses as well. Yeah, not so much of a big deal nowadays. Nerds are kind of in. But when I was young, it definitely was a big deal. Glasses of any sort pretty much sentenced you to being called a nerd and mocked relentlessly. So, while I was at camp, I mostly did my best to keep to myself. I did all the organized fun stuff, but whenever we had free time, I didn't hang out with anyone else. I just went to a corner and kept to myself. Thankfully, the camping experience was not very long. The whole thing lasted about 3 weeks in total or so. On the night before we went home, there would always be a camp dance. Now, I never attended this event. I didn't have any reason nor desire to do so. It wasn't like I was gonna dance with anybody, and I definitely didn't want to hang out with the assholes who were just gonna pick on me anyway. When I was 14 and in my 3rd year at that camp, the entire summer went pretty much exactly as it had the previous years. I kept to myself on the evening of the dance. I was gonna just stay in my cabin and read, but there was another kid who it turned out had planned on doing that as well. I wanted to be alone though, so I decided to change up my plans and go for a nice long walk into the woods. The dance began really late in the afternoon, so I had plenty of time to go ahead and be out in the woods before it got dark. I set off on my way. The problem was, though, that even though I had plenty of time to be out in the woods by myself, I didn't have much experience actually going out into the woods, and of course, I became lost very quickly. I also became very panicked after a while. I was doing my best to figure out a way to get back, even though I thought I had been really well read about what happens out in the woods. Turns out reading doesn't always equal actual practice. I tried like hell to search my way back before dark, but I got so turned around that before I knew it, day had already turned into dusk, and dusk into deep night. Before or since, I had never been more afraid in my entire life. But oh no, it got worse. While I was walking off the path through the trees, I eventually thought I began to hear someone following me. At first, I brushed it off as if it were nothing. Afterwards, though, I knew I was wrong. Something was definitely going on here. I could hear the sounds around me. I decided it must be an animal of some sort. Those thoughts didn't last very long, though. It soon became obvious by the sounds being made that whatever was following me was definitely walking on 2 legs. It was easy to tell from the way the sounds of the leaves were crackling under their feet. I wasn't sure how to react to this news. I thought it would surely be a bad idea to call out to the person. Obviously, they already knew I was there because they were currently following me. That meant they weren't a search party coming for me or something like that. Not that I had really been gone long enough for them to send one out. The dance was even still likely going on. This person wasn't talking for a reason, and whatever that reason might be, it surely could not be a good one. They followed me like that for God knows how long. Being followed was pretty awful, but not knowing why I was being followed made it so much worse. It never stopped, regardless of what direction I walked, what turns I made, or how I tried to hide. This person kept pace with me relentlessly. After time kept passing, I kept trying to move faster and faster through the woods. My anxiety was only growing exponentially. As I began to move faster, whoever was following me moved faster as well. Because they hadn't tried to do anything to me, I began to suspect that whoever this was just fucking with me, trying to scare me for some reason. I began to run at this point, and that was my big mistake. I couldn't see anything, and because of this, I tripped over the root of a tree and landed headfirst on a big rock. My mouth filled up with blood immediately, and although I couldn't see it at the time, one of my teeth had been knocked clean out. I had also been knocked loose and had a hard time trying to get my bearings. It turned out I didn't even have enough time to do that, though, as whoever was following me quickly grabbed me from behind and flipped me over. They began thrashing me and banged my head against the rock several more times before I blacked out altogether. When I came to once again, I was no longer in the forest anymore. I was now in a hospital bed an entire week after the event. My head injury had caused some swelling in my brain. I still have a slight traumatic brain injury to this day, and I had been out for a while because of this. I was found the following day when someone noticed I wasn't there and sent a party out to search for me. They found me practically naked, my clothes ripped to shreds, and me covered in wounds laying on a bloody rock. There was no sign of the person who'd bashed my head in. The worst thing about it all, though, is that even though I recovered quite well, other than the TBI and the scarring, I can't for the life of me figure out what the person in the woods wanted. If they wanted to surely kill me, they easily could have. But for some reason, they didn't. They just scared me for a while, injured me badly, and left. I mean, what was the point of that? Was it someone who was just evil and wanted to hurt someone? Why did they do any of it? This happened so long ago that I just don't know, and that's what scares me more than anything else, not knowing. When I was at camp, I had a pretty fun time for the most part. The only time I really didn't was my 4th year there. There was a big kid in my cabin who, as you might have guessed, was really just a big bully. His name was Carl, and he delighted on picking on just about everyone else there. It was completely miserable. All you could do was try to ignore him and hope he would get bored and leave you alone. But he was a bully, and bullies never get bored of bullying. Being in that camp with him was terrible. He'd do awful things, like when we were doing archery. When there was no counselors around, he would point the bow and arrow at one of us, with the arrow cocked. He would then pretend like his hand was slipping and accidentally let go of the arrow and shoot it at people. Then he threatened to beat the crap out of you if you went to the counselors about it. He'd punch guys in the middle of the night when they were sleeping right in the stomach, then laugh at them when they couldn't breathe. He was a grade A prick. It was pretty much like this with him throughout the entire camp. After a couple of weeks of putting up with him, I finally got fed up. I went and complained to one of the counselors. Carl got into huge trouble, of course, and was taken out of our cabin right away. He was also not allowed to go to the archery grounds ever again. I thought I was set up for a good time now for the rest of the camp, but boy was I wrong. Things were even worse after Carl was removed from the cabin. He made it clear to me that he knew it was me that had told on him, and he promised he was gonna kill me before camp was over. Although I didn't really believe he was actually going to kill me, I had no doubt he would try and get some sort of revenge. It turns out that revenge came when I was out hiking with my buddy Kevin. I wasn't aware of this in the beginning, but Carl must have followed us out hiking at some point. We were headed back to the camp. We had to pass over this rope bridge that was situated over a ravine. It was a pretty solid bridge that we had been over 100 times before. This time, though, when we were about halfway through crossing, Carl appeared to us on the far end, blocking our way out. I didn't know what to do, but Kevin sure did. He ran off in the opposite direction, leaving me behind. I was frozen in fear because I remembered his threat against me. I finally decided I needed to run too. I turned, but in my apprehension, I tripped and stumbled on the bridge. Carl quickly caught up with me. He grabbed me and roughly pulled me to my feet. Then he grabbed my head and forced me up against the rope side of the bridge. He rubbed my face against the rope over and over, burning me. "I told you I was gonna kill you, you fucker, and now I'm gonna throw you off this fucking bridge!" Carl sneered in my ear. I can admit I was crying. I honestly believed he was going to kill me. I pleaded with him to let me go and let him know I was sorry, but he didn't care. He basically told me to enjoy dying. I struggled as he started to lift me over the rope railing. Luckily, here comes Kevin. It turned out Kevin was not as cowardly as I thought he was. He knew what was happening, and though he hadn't seen Carl rubbing my face against the ropes, he had grabbed a huge rock and sprinted full speed at Carl. He smacked that son of a bitch right in the head with it, knocking him over and freeing me. He picked me up, and we both ran all the way back to camp. Carl was eventually taken away by the police and spent an awful long time in juvenile hall. He didn't get convicted of attempted murder because there was no way to honestly prove he was going to kill me. After that, he never came back to camp though. After he was convicted, I luckily never saw him again. I I'm a big camping fan, and I don't just mean camping out in some public camping place an hour's hike away from the parking lot. When I go camping deep into the woods, and generally even into the mountains. I generally would go into the Appalachian Mountains and get lost for a very long time. Well, not exactly lost. I'm a pretty experienced hiker, so I can generally find my way around. I don't set up camp in one place either. I like to hike all day and camp at night in various areas. The scariest thing that ever happened to me while hiking happened to me about 15 years ago. I had 2 weeks off work and planned on being out in the mountains the entire time. Now, I had to keep my car parked in town, then hitchhike out up into the hills in order to get out into the woods and get hiking. Whether I had the legal right to be hiking in that area, it's up for debate, I suppose. But I got a ride from an old man in a pickup truck, and we drove up out into the mountains. He dropped me off at least an hour past the last store or gas station we'd seen, wished me luck, and I was off on my way. It's important to know how often I do this, because you really can't go out this far into the mountains without having a touch of courage. You spend the entire time alone, and a lot of it is in the dark, even when it's not very dark outside. When the woods get very thick, it can get very intimidating. The slightest sound can startle you, and when you're so far away from civilization, the noises of everyday life are gone. The slightest sounds can really be amplified, and they can play tricks on your mind. I didn't have a problem for the most part with this, though. It wasn't until about the 4th night that while I was sleeping, I was suddenly woken up by a noise I'd heard outside my tent. There were a lot of leaves on the ground at this time of year, and I could have sworn I heard them crunching and rustling, as if someone was walking through them. Rather than get up and turn on my flashlight, however, I laid in my sleeping bag still as a nail and tried to listen to what was going on. I began to hear what sounded like heavy footfalls. I kept a knife with me in my tent, so I had it with me just in case something happened. I kept on listening, but it didn't sound like the footfalls were getting any closer to my tent. Instead, they seemed to be wandering about aimlessly. I kept hearing them for a while, until eventually they faded away altogether, and I was able to fall back to sleep after a while. The following day, even though I checked, there was no indication that anyone had been there. I didn't see anybody around, and I didn't hear anybody either as I was hiking. Everything seemed perfectly fine. I began to wonder if perhaps it had simply been an animal. That was only a small comfort, however, as it's quite possible for it to have been a dangerous animal as well. All that was the previous night, though, and during the day after, I didn't really have any problems. The following night, though, after I was asleep in my tent, I was once again woken up by that similar noise. It was unnerving how similar it was to the night before. It sounded like someone was walking around in the leaves, the same distance outside my tent, keeping an exact distance away from me. It carried on for about an hour, while I pretended to still be asleep. Once again, they faded away after a while. The day after that second night was pretty much like the previous day. There was nothing to indicate in any way that anyone had been anywhere near close to my tent. I couldn't even find any crunched up leaves. I was a bit freaked out at this point because of this. I found that even as I was hiking through the woods, I was very nervous and had to try my best to remain calm. The slightest noises were making me very jumpy. That night, there was a third occurrence of the noise. This time was a lot different, though. I was still woken up by the sound of what seemed like footsteps in the leaves, but this time they were much closer. I froze and gripped my knife tight in my hand. I could hear the footfalls coming closer and closer. They came close, but never once came right up to my tent. They stayed a certain distance away, and I could hear them gleefully crunching the leaves. At this point, I had no doubt these were the footfalls of another human being, and they were either watching me or doing something. Eventually, they walked away once again. This time, I couldn't get back to sleep, though. I was awake long after they were gone. I'm sure it had to be hours before I finally got a little bit drowsy, but it was a very rough and broken sleep, and I was on edge the entire time. When I finally decided to get up and get out of my tent in the morning, I decided that it was best to take a hike back and get off this mountain as soon as possible. That decision was quickly confirmed as I emerged from my tent and saw a small piece of what looked like poster board tacked to a tree in the distance. I got a bit closer and started to read. It was facing my tent, with these words written on it: "We know you're not sleeping. Leave now." Every word told me so much. "We" meant there was more than one of them. "No, you're not sleeping" meant they knew I was awake, and they obviously wanted me gone from the last part. Of course, not to mention the implication of what they might do to me if I didn't leave. I packed up right away and sprinted the other way. It took me several days to get back to the road. Sleeping each night was a nightmare, although I never did hear those footsteps again. I guess they knew I was now going in the opposite direction and had no reason to scare and threaten me like they had been doing. I was still terrified though, and was scared all the way till I got back to the road. I was even scared hitchhiking back. I didn't stop being scared until I was in the safety of my own car and driving back home. I still hike and camp nowadays, though I live in Colorado and hike the mountains there instead. This happened to me when I went camping with my boyfriend about 10 years ago. I myself was never really that much into camping, but it was one of his absolute favorite things to do, so I agreed to go along this time. He told me he had a really nice spot that he'd like to camp out at, and it would take a good day of hiking to get out to it. We packed up our backpacks and our bags full of things, and we headed out. He hadn't been kidding about the good day of hiking. We started out well before sunrise, and it was late into the afternoon by the time we got to where we wanted to camp. Still, I had to admit it was quite the beautiful area. While my boyfriend was setting up the tent and the campground area, I told him I would gather up some firewood to make a fire with. I went off and had a little bit of trouble finding good wood at first. I had to search pretty far from the camp. Actually, I got so far away that I stumbled across a large river, or perhaps a large creek. I'm not really sure what it was qualified as. As I got closer to this river, I noticed a pretty nasty-looking guy sitting on the bank with a matted dog. He looked just like what you would expect a hermit to look like. Long beard, shaggy hair, dressed in filthy rags for clothing. As much as I decided it was my best interest to try and avoid this hermit, he did catch notice of me. When he did, he shot up and motioned for his dog to come over and follow him. I tried to pretend like I hadn't seen him, but that didn't deter the man. He called out to me. I pretended not to hear him. That didn't deter him either. Eventually, he caught up to me, and I wasn't able to pretend like he wasn't there anymore. Thankfully, the man seemed friendly enough. Something about him just kinda creeped me out though. It didn't make me any less nervous when I noticed he had a big knife sheath on his boot. He never made any attempt to reach for it or even threaten me in any way though. Instead, he began to bombard me with questions. What was a pretty little lady like me doing out in the wilderness all by myself? I explained that I was not in fact by myself. I was camping with my boyfriend, and I was out looking for firewood. The hermit didn't seem to believe me. He kept looking at me like he'd just gotten out of prison or something, and I was the first person he'd seen in decades. Hell, as far as I know, I was the first woman he'd ever seen. He kept on calling me pretty little lady and wouldn't leave me alone. It took a long time to eventually get away from him. When I did manage to leave him, he whispered that he would be keeping an eye out for me to make sure I was protected. He told me he was sure my boyfriend couldn't do the job on his own. When I got back to camp, I told all of this to my boyfriend. I wasn't really worried though. My boyfriend was a pretty big guy, and I was sure he would be able to easily fight off the hermit if he showed up. We just concentrated on having a good time. Eventually, we went back to our tent and went to sleep. Really deep into the night, I was awoken by a sudden noise. I snapped to attention and listened closely. My mind immediately went back to that hermit. It definitely sounded like someone was creeping around outside our tent. I woke my boyfriend up and told him I just heard something. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, he began to hear it too. My boyfriend snapped awake and looked around, telling me to lay low. He crept out of the tent. This is where the worst part happened. He was gone for a really long time. Fortunately, the fire was still burning outside, so if he did come back, I would be able to see him. I got really worried though, because he must have gone really far from the tent. It didn't make sense that he would go so far away without telling me. Then I saw a shadow of a figure approaching. I could see it very clearly through the fabric. As this person just stood there, I prayed that it was my boyfriend, but I pretty much already knew it was not. There was no way he would just stand there like that, because he knew that would scare me. "Brad?" I croaked, my voice dry and timid. "It's me, pretty little lady." I heard the voice of the hermit respond to me. He didn't sound as friendly as he had before. He sounded sinister. It was more than enough to scare me to jump out the door of the tent and run in the opposite direction for all I was worth. I quickly ran into my boyfriend and told him what happened. He kept me close as we made our way back to the camp. By the time we got there, though, the hermit was long gone. Our tents had been cut to shreds, obviously by the hunting knife he'd sheathed on his boot. I told Brad I wanted to leave, but it would be dumb to travel in the dark. Instead, we stayed awake by the fire until dawn and packed up and left as soon as it came. I never went camping again. I think I was around 9 years old when this event happened. You'd think that such an impactful memory would ingrain itself completely into my brain, that I would remember exactly when it happened and every single small little detail. But it was one of those really scary things that I honestly would have been happier to just forget altogether. My dad and I like to go camping all the time, you see. He began taking me when I was much younger, and I even had my own little pip tent. I loved it. It was small, but hey, so was I, so it worked out just fine in the end. My favorite thing about camping would be that in lieu of ghost stories, my dad would actually do this little puppet show for me. We would put up my tent to the side so the side wall of it would be facing the fire, and he would do this little shadow puppet thing with his hands. It was actually really fun, and he was super good at it too, surprisingly. The fact was that with a crackling fire behind him as he made these hand puppets, the images turned out to be really solid, and sometimes really creepy. Generally, by the time he was done telling his story, I would be so tuckered out I'd fall right to sleep. I won't go into too much detail about the camping trip itself when this happened. It was just me and my father. My mom didn't really like camping, so she never went with us. We go out into the woods, set up our tents, and made the area up for the fire. We then went and did some fishing. We actually had a nice haul that day, which my father then cooked for us over the fire. I always did love fish, and love it to this day. No one can cook a fish as good as my father did. When it came closer to time to go to bed, I was excited because that meant two things. My dad and I would make some s'mores together, and then I would go into my tent with the s'mores while my dad told me his story, using his scary hand puppets. Once I had my plate full of treats, I eagerly rushed into my tent. I got all nestled into my sleeping bag and ate those s'mores while my dad told a few scary stories. It was pretty fun. I dozed off though before the ending of the last one. I woke up a little bit later, not even realizing how long I'd been asleep, or even what time it was currently. I assumed I'd only dozed off for a moment though, and that my father must not have even realized this, because he still seemed to be doing his hand puppet show. I opened my eyes wide and sat up in my tent, watching him intently. He wasn't actually telling me a story anymore though. He was making a hand puppet of a bunny rabbit, and kind of just making it aimlessly hop around on the wall of the tent. I kept waiting for him to say something funny, or something scary, like it was a vicious killer rabbit or something, but he didn't say a single word. Instead, he just kept making this bunny hop around in a circle, coming closer to my tent, then going further away. He kept this up for quite a long time, too. I was a bit confused now, so I decided to open my tent and see if something was wrong. The shadows had gotten quite close now, so I unzipped the flap and opened it up, and looked over to my father, only to see it was not my father at all. It was a strange man I'd never seen before, with a sick grin on his face. He continued to make bunny motions with his hands as he stared right into my eyes. Then he stopped, and he rushed over to the tent and grabbed me. I, of course, screamed before the guy could get his hand over my mouth. My father woke up right away and came rushing out of the tent. When he saw the man struggling with me, he had the wherewithal to grab the fish skillet and smack the man upside the head with it twice before the guy fell over. I was now free, but my dad was not done yet. I can't tell you how many times he bashed this man over the head, who was now struggling to return to his feet. Eventually he managed to, and ran stumbling off into the night. My dad decided it was best to just leave, rather than wait until the morning. Fortunately, we hadn't parked too far away. We grabbed all of our stuff, rushed to the truck, and went home right away. That strange man ruined camping for me for years. Whenever we talked about going, I would see that man's horrifying face and remember him grabbing me, and I would have to decline. This story happened back in the 1970s. Thinking back on it, it's kind of weird, because there's no way anyone could get away with something like this nowadays. I was 10 years old at the time, and sitting in class. It was about 10:30 in the morning, I believe. We had been back from lunch for a while. The school secretary suddenly rushed in and handed the teacher a note. After reading the note, the teacher handed it back. Then she said, "Josh, would you please go with Miss Harris?" All of the kids in class went, "Ooh," like kids do when they assume that another child just got in trouble. My teacher tried to quiet them down as I walked out and followed her into the hallway. She told me she'd just received a phone call from my father that my brother had been in a terrible accident. They couldn't come to pick me up, but they wanted me to come straight home right now. Now, I walked to and from school. Everyone in my town did, really. Only the kids who lived in the outskirts of town actually got to ride the bus. I grabbed my backpack and headed out right away. Of course, I was worried about my younger brother and figured I should get back as quickly as possible. I had been walking for only a few minutes when I started to hear footsteps right behind me. I turned around to check and saw a rather tall man was now following me from a bit far a ways back. He was wearing a dark coat and covered his face, but it was cold enough outside that I didn't think very much about it in the moment. We weren't the only two people out walking, as it was right in the middle of both a school and work day. My walk home was a large trek. I had to go down several different streets and through a park as well. When I turned down the first street, I was walking for a while before I heard the footsteps behind me again. I peeked around my shoulder and noticed the man had turned the corner as well and was still following me. It was at this point I began to get a little bit nervous, but I was still not totally worried. The moment I did begin to get very worried was when I turned the following corners and still heard the man walking behind me. We had watched film strips at school about strangers, and all the frightening images those had put in my mind suddenly came rushing back. I began to think that this man was a legitimate kidnapper or something. As I got closer to the park, I decided to cut under a break in the chain-link fence that some of us kids like to sneak through. A bigger guy wouldn't be able to get through that space, and I figured I'd be able to lose him really quickly. With a quick peek over my shoulder, I noticed the man was now not far behind me, so I had to hurry. When I came upon the fence, I saw the little trench under it. I knew I would fit right away, so I hurried up and slipped onto my belly and began to slide under. The problem with my plan was that all the previous times I'd tried to go under the fence, I hadn't had my backpack on my back, and I'd forgotten this. I didn't fit. My backpack got snagged on the fence. I hadn't been listening to the footsteps any longer, but it didn't matter anymore, because the man was right on me. He grabbed my foot and tried to pull me back from under the fence. I tried to kick him with my other foot, but I was just a small kid. It didn't do much good. While I was struggling in his grip, I kept trying to pull my arms out of the straps of my backpack. It was snagged, and I was not going to get it undone. I kept trying to kick the man, and although it did take a while, I was able to get the straps to slide off of me. The problem was this asshole still had my leg. I focused on repeatedly kicking his hand with my other leg, and he slightly lost his grip. He grabbed onto my shoe. That turned out to be a bit of luck that I needed, though, as I was able to slip my foot right out of it. The man stumbled backward, and I had enough time to slip the rest of the way through the fence. I then got up and ran as fast as I could, with only one shoe through that park. Fortunately, there was a mother with 2 kids at the playground. I ran up to them crying and scared. The woman was very sweet and took me home to my parents. When I got home, my mom was home, but my dad wasn't. She was worried and thanked the woman who helped me, who also explained everything that happened. I swear, you've never seen a mother so grateful. But what shocked me the most was when I saw my little brother right there, sitting in front of the television and watching a game show. He wasn't hurt at all. My dad wasn't home waiting for me. My mom called the police, who found my backpack. It had been thoroughly emptied, and my belongings were scattered all over the place. My parents had never called the school. All we could figure out was that the man who attacked me had to have set the entire thing up. I never found out who he was either, but I always figured it had to be someone my parents knew. How else would he have been able to know when I was at school, and even who I was, that I had a brother as well? In the beginning of this story, I mentioned that this sort of thing couldn't happen nowadays. Well, I only guessed that really. I don't know that for a fact, but I sure as hell hope it can't, because that shit is pretty damn scary. This happened when I was around 13 or so. I was quite a tomboy back in the day, and had a huge collection of Nerf guns. Although I did have some girlfriends, my friends were mainly guys who had collections which rivaled my own. My group consisted of around 5 people. One day, my friends and I, being the kids we were, decided to organize a Nerf war held at our local park. It wasn't the typical big open green space though. It was more of a forest, as we were in Australia. Because of this, the park was filled with big gum trees to hide behind and had a long creek running down the middle. The perfect conditions for a Nerf war. We set the date, and one of my friends said he would bring a bunch of his friends over as well, so we'd have much bigger teams and a bigger event. This meant we'd have about 4 people on each side. We agreed, and they came as well. By the time the chosen Sunday rolled around, we were all ready and kitted up for the fight. I, like everyone else, had brought most of my Nerf guns along, which I then shared amongst my team. Some of us even brought walkie-talkies and other special gadgets. To onlookers, we probably looked quite silly, but we really didn't care. The excitement of being with all my friends forced back my usual shy nature. Anyway, after everyone arrived, we started working on our bases. Then we began the war. All was going well until about an hour in. I sat alone at our team's makeshift base. My main weapon had jammed, and I was trying to fix it by poking sticks into the barrel and repeatedly pressing the trigger, all to no avail, of course. The others on my team were off scouting through the woods. All I could hear were Nerf blasters going off, until an unsettling whistling noise suddenly came from behind me. I could hear footsteps on the dried leaves, getting closer and closer. At first, I assumed it was one of my teammates playing a joke on me, so I kept working on my gun with my back to the trees. But then, I saw him. His face still haunts me to this day. There was a tall old man, probably in his 60s or so, walking right by me. He had unwashed clothes, and he was swinging a gray plastic bag, which looked as though it was filled with dried blood. I couldn't really tell what it was. He noticed me and stopped walking, standing about 15 feet away. His eyes widened as he looked over at me, and he continued to whistle some tune I didn't recognize. I remember feeling terrified. I was alone, with nothing but a jammed Nerf gun for protection. I thought if I kept ignoring him, he might go away, but of course he didn't. He stopped in place and kept staring at me. My thoughts turned to making a plan of action. He didn't look like he'd be able to outrun me, but I still felt too terrified to move. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed for my mom, still not meeting his uncomfortable gaze. I held the phone up to my ear and tried to appear as though I didn't even notice him. "Ryan." I flinched as I didn't hear my mom's voice. I heard his calling out to me. He stopped the whistling and began to speak to me in a raspy voice. "Come and play with me, little girl." He started to swing the bag once more. Our eyes met, just as my mom picked up the phone. I whispered to her there was a strange man trying to talk to me. I could feel myself tearing up. Even now, I can't forget the way he was staring at me, like an animal who decided he was going to eat me. My mom was furiously telling me to calm down, and she couldn't understand what I was saying. The man finally stopped staring when my younger team member called out to me, saying their gun was broken. It happened to be my younger sister, who my mom had forced me to bring along. The man turned away from me and started towards her instead. I was begging my mom to come and find us, and that the man was now after my sister, who was only 9 at the time. She told me to gather up my sister and everyone else who was with us. I was so scared, but I managed to find the courage to run into the woods and call to everyone else for help. Thankfully, the man hadn't caught my sister yet. The others all came running. Only one of them seemed to have seen him walking through the woods prior. They said he was walking quite quickly, almost running. They thought it was odd, but thought nothing of it at the time. Once we all gathered together, I guess the man was intimidated by our numbers and took off running back into the forest. The worst and most terrifying thing that ever happened to me happened because of my former stepdad. Even now, years later, I get so pissed off just thinking about it. If I could, I would beat the shit out of him. After my father passed away, my mother fell into a horrible and understandable depression. She began dating this guy who, while my father was still alive, she wouldn't have even considered giving the time of day to. Jack was a big guy, and a complete lowlife as well. I really don't want to go into too much description of him, because it infuriates me to even try. I can't stand this guy. My mother's relationship with Jack was completely toxic. They would go to these biker bars and go out and drink all night. I'd never seen my mom drunk a day in my 15 years of life before, but once she met Jack, she got drunk all the time. After less than a month of dating, my mom let him move in. She didn't even ask my opinion. Now, I know what most of you are probably thinking. She didn't need my permission, and I realized that it's not permission I was worried about. I feel like she should have asked my opinion on the matter, and made up her own mind after that. Jack didn't work, of course. My mom did, and he would stay home all day on his lazy ass, watching TV and drinking beer. He knew I didn't like him, but he lorded this fact over me. Whenever I looked like I was angry with him or that I wasn't going to follow his orders, he'd say words I would never forget. "You damn well do it, or I'm gonna cut your balls off." He said that to me all the time. I never took it seriously. I mean, the guy was a jackass and a loser, but he wasn't stupid enough to actually do anything physical to me. I mean, if he even tried, he'd be sitting in a damn prison cell. It would always be something like, "Get me a fucking beer or I'll cut your balls off," or over something stupid and minor. I wasn't really happy with this. He even said it in front of my mom, and she just laughed. She married him too, and it was quick. He had been living there for only 3 months when she married him, and like most of these stories, that was the moment when things began to get even worse. The nights of going out and drinking at the bar still happened, but rather than coming home and having a fun time, they'd always be fighting. I tried to spend as much time as I could in my bedroom, not listening to their bullshit. He threatened to smack her all the time, but he never did. He would then guilt my mom into forgiving him, and the whole thing would start all over again the next night. The thing that makes me angry, that makes me fume with unadulterated anger, happened on my 16th birthday. Of course, neither of them did anything to celebrate for me. My mom and Jack went out drinking. I went to my bedroom to read, because it was the only thing I really could do. I was reading late into the night. It had to be around 1:30 in the morning or so, when I heard Jack's bike pull up in the driveway. I heard them arguing and rolled my eyes and groaned, wishing I could at least not have to deal with this on my birthday. They rushed into the house, yelling and screaming. I don't even know what they were arguing about. The one thing that was different this time, though, was I heard my mom scream at Jack. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a savage hit, and the loudest crashing I'd ever heard in my life. I jumped out of my bed, scared and knowing what had just happened. When I got into the living room, my fears were confirmed. My mom was laying bleeding and unconscious on the floor over a broken coffee table. Anger flooded my body. I ran up and tried to tackle that piece of shit that hit my mother. Although I slammed into him pretty hard, it didn't have much effect on him. He easily smacked me and knocked me hard to the floor. I was seeing stars when he grabbed me by my shirt and dragged me into the kitchen. I didn't know what he was doing, but he grabbed something off the counter, picked me up, and slammed me hard against the kitchen wall, completely knocking the wind out of me. It was then I saw him holding a knife in his hand. I winced, expecting Jack to kill me right then. Instead, to my shock, he reached down, undid my belt, and opened up my jeans, pushing them and my boxers to the floor. I was confused at first, but then the words he'd always threatened me with came rushing back to my head. Jack really was going to cut my balls off. He moved the knife down, while holding me against the wall by my neck with one arm. I was thrashing and struggling, doing everything I could to get this fucker off me, but I couldn't force him off no matter what I did. I felt tears going down my eyes, completely convinced I was about to be castrated. I felt him begin to cut. If you've never been cut in a sensitive place before, you might not understand what happened next. It was a blinding pain. Everything went white. Flailing in agony, I kicked out over and over. I kicked him in the balls, the knees, the stomach. I even kicked his hand, knocking the knife away. My adrenaline was really rushing. It was the shock of what was going on that had him struggling the most. Then a shot rang out. He let go of me and screamed. I guess a beautiful story would have been that he fell over and I saw my mother standing there holding the gun behind him. But no, there was a gun, being held by our kindly next-door neighbor, Janice, a 67-year-old widow who never put up with anyone's bullshit. She'd heard everything going on, grabbed her rifle, and rushed over. If you've never seen an old grandma pissed off and holding a rifle, you've never lived before. Jack went to prison, and my mom, of course, divorced him. I was happy she wasn't seriously injured. Jack had actually seriously cut my privates, which led me to believe my balls weren't his only target that night. Fortunately, it wasn't too bad that it wasn't able to be fixed, but it hurt worse than anything I've ever experienced before or since. I got a pretty gnarly scar. At least it makes an interesting story, but my blood boils just telling it. Generally, I try to tell people it was just a childhood injury and not talk about it after. I've never seen Jack again, and my mom never got married again either.